I was never the kind of guy who believed in those road stories, the ones about ghost towns or places that no longer exist. I always thought they were exaggerations, told by lonely truck drivers or people trying to add a touch of mystery to their endless journeys. But what happened to me that night, there is no explanation. I will never look at the road the same way again. The truth is, when you're alone on a road for so many hours, what seemed like just any story can become a very real nightmare. And after that night, I know there are things we can't always understand. The cargo I was transporting was nothing special, just industrial equipment, the type of delivery I make almost every week. The city where I needed to leave the cargo was about 3 hours away from the main highway, so I knew it would be a long but peaceful trip. The day was warm, the sun was setting over the horizon, and I played my tunes as I drove down the empty road. When I arrived at the exit to the city, it was already night. Normally, these places are empty, but when I entered the secondary road, something seemed strange. It wasn't just the emptiness of the small town, it was a deeper silence, an uncomfortable silence that seemed to envelop me as I approached. That bothered me, but I ignored it. When I arrived, the city was not just empty, it was still. I parked the truck in the driveway and looked around, feeling something strange in the air. The streets were deserted, there were no lights at all. No houses with a lit window, no parked cars, nothing. In places like this, the lack of movement was not normal, and yet, what scared me most was the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you expect in a small town at night. It was a muffled silence, as if the city had been swallowed by something invisible. I got out of the truck and looked closer, trying to understand what was happening, but what I saw only made me more uncomfortable. The houses were well cared for but looked abandoned, as if no one had lived there for years but time hadn't touched them. I decided to head downtown, looking for a gas station or store where I could ask what was going on. Even with all that strange feeling in the air, I needed to deliver the cargo, so I thought maybe it was just an atypical night for the place. But the truth is that, as I got closer to the center, the city only seemed more desolate. The square was empty, there was no one walking around, not a soul. Even the stores had their doors open, as if people had left in a hurry, without closing anything behind them. I stopped the truck in front of a convenience store, and as much as I was aware that I was in an abandoned town, I couldn't help but feel like I was trespassing on something. As if I had arrived too late, when there was no one else there, but something was still watching me. The convenience store was strangely well stocked, but everything seemed out of place. The shelves were full, but the feeling of desolation in the room made me feel like the place shouldn't be there anymore. The fluorescent light flickered slightly, which only increased the feeling that I was in an abandoned setting. I ran my hand along the wall, almost without meaning to, and noticed that the paint was peeling, but in a way that seemed recent, as if something had made this place lose life. The floor was dirty, with marks as if someone had dragged heavy furniture. I stood there for a while, just looking. How can anyone forget to close a store like this? How can an entire city disappear overnight? I went back to the truck and tried calling the delivery number, but the line was dead. It was already late, the only thing left was to get back on the road, but something was stopping me from leaving. It was as if something was calling me, pulling me deeper into the city. So, without knowing why, I decided to move on. I started walking through the streets, with no destination in mind. The city was even quieter than before, and now I realized that not only was it deserted, but it also seemed disconnected from the rest of the world. As if it weren't a real place, as if it had been erased from some map and forgotten by whoever was responsible for it. I walked a few more blocks and came across a house that seemed even more out of place than the others. The windows were covered with a tarp tied together in a makeshift manner, and the front door was open, almost as if someone had left in a hurry. I stood there, in front of the house, as if I was waiting for something to happen. There was no sound coming from inside, but a feeling of something watching enveloped me. Then, as if the city wanted to keep me there, the wind, which had previously been calm, began to blow stronger. I entered the house, not knowing why I was doing this, but feeling that some answer might be there. The interior was empty except for some furniture covered with sheets. But there was something strange about the sheets, something that made me hesitate for a second. They seemed to be hiding something, something I didn't want to see. What really made me feel deep apprehension was the smell. It was a strange smell, mixed with mold and something else. I couldn't place it, but the air was heavy, as if something had been stifled there. I decided to move away from the covered furniture and went straight to the back of the house. The doors in the back were open, as if someone had left, and what was worse, what I saw left me unresponsive. It was a small window at the back of the house, which looked out onto a courtyard that seemed completely untouched by time. But the most curious thing was that there were marks on the floor, marks of something very heavy that seemed to have been dragged. And there, in the middle, in the courtyard, was a hole, not very big, but deep enough to leave me with the feeling that something was buried there. Something that I absolutely did not want to find out what it was. I stayed there, standing at the entrance to that courtyard, for what seemed like forever. The hole stared at me, almost challenging my courage, and I knew I shouldn't get any closer. But somehow I couldn't take my eyes off him. The smell of the heavy air was becoming unbearable, and the wind now seemed to want to push me into that hole. I thought about getting out of there, getting back in the truck and just leaving, but a strange feeling came over me. Something told me that I couldn't leave without understanding what was happening there. As if the city, or whatever was behind this, wouldn't let me get away without an explanation. I crouched down near the hole and hesitantly began to pick at the ground. It was difficult to dig with my hands, but I needed to know what was there, as if something inside me demanded it. The air around me seemed to condense, the silence became even heavier, and the smell became unbearable. My every movement was slow, as if time itself was slowing down. And then, with one last push of dirt, something solid appeared. It was a box, not very big, but heavy. I pulled it out and, with trembling fingers, opened it. Inside the box was a pile of old papers and photos of people who looked familiar but I couldn't identify. Some were partially torn, but what really froze me was the last photo. It was a photo of the city, taken from an angle I immediately recognized. And the most bizarre thing? The date was marked in the corner of the photo, 2014. How can a city disappear like that, and the photo is so recent? With the box in my hands, a wave of panic washed over me. I didn't know what to do. That's when I heard the sound. Not a physical sound, but a sensation, a vibration in the air, as if the city were breathing. It was a muffled noise, but it was getting louder, more intense. I looked around, trying to understand where it was coming from, but everything was empty, completely empty. The wind picked up, almost pushing me away from the courtyard, and I felt pressure in my chest. It wasn't just fear, it was something more, as if the city itself was expelling me. On impulse, I ran back to the truck, without looking back. I no longer wanted to know what was happening there. I knew that even if I left, I would never be able to forget what I saw. When I finally got back on the road, it felt like the world was back to normal. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, the city was no longer there. There was nothing left, not even a road where there used to be an entrance. I only saw the asphalt, the open road in front of me, as if that place had never existed. I tried calling the office, telling them what had happened, but the lines were dead. There was no one else. The city was gone, somehow, and I had no idea what happened there. And to this day, whenever I pass through that region, I feel goosebumps. As if something was still watching me. And honestly, I don't know if I really want to know what happened. I've never been a big fan of traveling at night, but as a truck driver, I don't have much of a choice. The road is always emptier, and deliveries need to be made. That night, I was heading north, taking a small road, far from the big cities. The sky was cloudless, but the air smelled like something was about to happen. Everything was peaceful, with the truck's lights cutting through the darkness, until the radio started to fail. It wasn't anything too serious, just that occasional squeak, the kind of thing anyone would ignore. But at some point the sound changed. I started to hear something, like whispers. At first I thought it was some kind of interference, maybe a weak signal. But the whispers didn't stop. And they weren't normal voices. They were low, almost as if someone was speaking close to my ear. I tried changing the tuning, turning the knob from side to side, but the sound wouldn't go away. Those voices seemed to insist on following me. It must be some joke with the radio frequency, I thought, trying to convince myself that it was nothing more serious. But the problem is, as I drove down the road, the whispers seemed to intensify, as if they were becoming clearer. And then I heard laughter. It wasn't just any laugh, it was a crooked sound that sent shivers up my spine. I quickly glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind me, just the empty road stretching away into nothingness. The radio was still crackling, but the laughter was stronger now, more present. The worst thing was that it felt like it was coming from inside the truck, like it was a presence inside me. I frowned, turned off the radio for a moment, hoping that when I turned it back on, the sound would go away. But that wasn't what happened. When I turned the radio back on, the whispers came back, louder than before, mixed with that macabre laugh. I stopped the truck on the shoulder, looking around, trying to understand what was happening. There were no lights, just the road in front of me and the trees around it, dark and imposing. I knew there was no cell phone signal there, so I couldn't ask for help. The feeling that someone was watching me began to consume me. I looked at the radio once again, feeling pressure in my chest, as if the sound was invading me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I turned on the radio once again, and this time it wasn't just whispers and laughter. I heard a word, a clear word, and it seemed to come from inside the cabin, "Come." My heart skipped a beat when I heard that word. It was a strange feeling, as if someone was right next to me, whispering directly into my ear. I looked around once again, as if expecting to see something or someone there. But the road was deserted, and the night continued its silent march. I didn't know what to do. The feeling of being watched was becoming unbearable. I turned off the radio again, trying to take a deep breath, thinking that would be enough to break the tension. But when I looked at the truck's dashboard, I saw that the radio was still on, and the indicator light was glowing dimly, as if it was waiting for something. I felt a chill run up my spine, and before I could decide what to do, the sound returned. It wasn't just whispers or laughter, but a mix of distorted voices, as if several people were trying to communicate at once. The strangest thing was when I realized that the voices were no longer random. They were forming sentences, as if they were telling me something that didn't make sense. I desperately tried to change the station, but there was nothing left, just that muffled and disconnected sound, with laughter that intertwined and mixed with the noise of the radio, making everything even more confusing. Suddenly, one of the voices stood out among the others. She was clear, direct, and seemed to come from inside my head, as if she were calling me by name. I knew what I was hearing, and terror gripped me. "Don't look back," said the voice. I froze. Time seemed to slow down. I looked in the rearview mirror, my heart sinking. I saw nothing but the darkness of the road. But the feeling that something was there, right behind me, was palpable. Something was watching me, something I couldn't see but I knew was there, waiting, as if it was approaching slowly, in no hurry. Then the radio made a strange noise, as if something was pushing the static to its maximum. And in the next instant, the sound stopped completely. The night, which had previously seemed full of tension, now seemed even denser. I remained silent, looking at the radio, waiting for the sound to return, but nothing happened. The truck was stopped in the middle of the road, and fear was engulfing me. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just tiredness getting louder. But somehow I knew this wasn't normal. And once again, the voice, now softer and almost distant, said, "It's coming." I could barely breathe. The fear was so strong that my head was spinning. What was happening? I looked in the rearview mirror once more, but all I saw was the empty road, as if it were an ordinary road, with nothing out of place. However, the silence at that moment seemed more threatening than any sound. I turned off the engine, trying to hear something, anything that would explain what was happening. The road ahead of me seemed endless, and I was alone. The radio, now completely silent, still seemed to challenge me to look for answers where there were none. I remained there for a long time, perhaps longer than I should have, without the courage to continue the journey. The idea of moving forward seemed insane, but the fear of staying there, trapped in that place, was even greater. I decided to start the engine and move on, but what happened next left me paralyzed. The radio, out of nowhere, made that strange hiss again, and the same voice, with the same intensity, said, "Go away." I looked ahead, but I couldn't take my eyes off the rearview mirror. I felt a growing pressure, as if something was pushing me to make a quick decision. I didn't know if fear was consuming me or if what was happening was real. But what really scared me was that when I looked at the dashboard again, I saw what appeared to be a shadow, small and dark, passing quickly across the rearview glass. I didn't see her clearly, but something inside me knew I wasn't alone, that someone or something was there. The feeling that he was being followed increased with every second. I accelerated without thinking, faster than I should have, feeling the truck respond as if it were being guided by an external force. In the end, I couldn't listen to the radio anymore. I don't know if the signal finally disappeared or if my mind just couldn't take it anymore. I kept driving, faster, until the road began to narrow, and the surrounding trees seemed to close in on me. The feeling of being chased never left me. I drove and drove, until finally, the lights of a small town began to appear in the distance. I didn't know if I was relieved to see civilization or if I was even more terrified because I didn't know what had happened. I stopped the truck at a gas station, feeling like I couldn't go any further. I went to the cashier, but the attendant didn't even seem to care about my arrival. The radio? Off. The silence? It was back. And when I got back to the truck, something I'll never forget, the rear-view mirror was fogged up, like someone had breathed on it, but I was alone. I had been traveling for a few hours, longer than usual, when the truck unexpectedly broke down. There was no sign of any gas station nearby, and the road was completely deserted. The only thing left was to try and look for something, anything, to take shelter while I waited for the engine to cool down. That's when I saw a small refuge on the side of the road. It wasn't a house, nor a rest station, but it looked like some kind of old cabin, with the windows covered in dust and the door ajar, as if it was waiting for someone. I didn't want to go in, but the lack of options made me walk there, feeling a strange feeling that maybe it was exactly what I needed. Upon pushing the door open, I was greeted by a heavy look, as if the place had been closed for decades. The smell of old wood and mold filled my nostrils, and darkness instantly enveloped me. It was strange, because even though it was so stuffy, there didn't seem to be any signs of decay or complete abandonment. The walls were covered in worn but still intact wallpaper, and the furniture, although old, was in good condition. The room seemed to be frozen in time. A dining table, with aged wooden chairs, stood in the center. Around, some framed photos, yellowed with age, hung on the walls. But what caught my attention the most was that, in all those photos, the people were strangers to me. None of them seemed to have any relation to the place. I walked around the room, touching the furniture with shaking hands, trying to understand what was happening. There was something strange there, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The photos showed families, couples, children, but no one I recognized. All the people seemed distant, as if the photos had been taken a long time ago, but at the same time, those images didn't seem to be from a distant time. Everything seemed a little out of place, as if time had stopped in that environment. The feeling of being watched came over me as I walked through the rooms, even though there was no one there. As I passed a covered window, I looked outside and noticed that the night was even darker than before. As if the place was swallowing me, separating me from the rest of the world. I stayed there for a few minutes, not knowing what to do. The feeling of discomfort only increased as he explored the refuge more. I knew I needed to leave soon, but something was stopping me from doing so. Maybe it was tiredness, maybe it was the strange feeling of security that this place offered me. But the moment I decided to turn around and leave, something strange happened. When I opened the door, I was faced with nothingness. The road that had once been in front of me, the same road I had come on, was now gone. In its place, there was just an empty landscape, as if I had been transported to another place. I looked back and saw that the refuge, which was previously there, had completely disappeared. There was nothing left but an open field and the road that seemed to have disappeared. I stood there, at the door, looking at that empty field. What the hell was going on? There was no logical explanation for what I was seeing. The refuge, the place I had entered a few minutes before, was simply not there anymore. I took a few steps forward, trying to understand if this was some kind of illusion, but what I saw was even more disturbing. The road was gone, and the only path I could see was an open field, with tall grass swaying gently in the wind. It was as if the cabin had been swallowed by the earth, leaving nothing behind, as if it had never existed. I tried to go around, looking for any sign of the cabin, but there was nothing. No clues, no marks, nothing. Just the empty field and the feeling of increasing disorientation. I glanced at my truck, expecting to see the same familiar scene, but even it looked out of place. It didn't seem to be where I left it. The feeling that everything was wrong, that I was trapped in some kind of distortion, was overwhelming. My mind was wondering, every second, if I had actually entered some physical place or if it was all a nightmare, a hallucination caused by fatigue. But deep down, I knew that what I felt couldn't simply be imagined. I went back to where the refuge was and looked once more, as if I expected him to return. But nothing. Only the field, now illuminated by the pale light of the moon, seemed to stare back at me, like a cruel joke. I knew I was no longer on the same road. The feeling that he was being watched intensified even more. I crouched on the ground, touching the earth, trying to understand what was happening. That's when I saw something that made me freeze, a small stone, completely out of place. She was close to where the refuge door should have been. I picked it up and looked closer. It was covered in white powder, but what caught my attention most was the inscription on the stone. It didn't appear to be anything special, but as I turned the stone over, I noticed it was engraved with a name. The name was mine. My mind spun. How was that there? I had left that refuge and didn't see anyone. But this stone, with my name, seemed to have come from somewhere, from some time that I couldn't understand. The feeling that I was trapped in a place between the real and the unreal overwhelmed me. I needed to get out of there. I ran toward the truck, but the field in front of me seemed endless. The road, which was supposed to be my way back, now seemed to go on forever, getting lost in the darkness. The anguish of not knowing where I was, of not knowing what was happening, consumed me. That's when, looking at the truck, I realized that it was also different. He was further away than I remembered, and when I tried to walk toward him, the same empty field surrounded me again. As if the place had distorted, trapping me in that never-ending cycle. I was starting to panic. My mind was in complete turmoil, trying to piece together something that didn't make sense. How did the refuge disappear? How does the field seem to stretch endlessly without an answer? I tried to move forward, but the feeling that something was watching me didn't leave me. The field around me felt oppressive, as if it were pushing me back to where I started, to the center of the nightmare. I looked up at the sky, trying to find some guidance, but the moon was full, shining strangely, as if it was watching everything I did. That's when I looked around and noticed something even more disturbing. The surrounding trees began to move, slowly, as if they were bending towards me. There was no wind. They simply moved, as if they were being guided by something invisible. I felt trapped, with no way out. The feeling that I was in a place outside of time and space was overwhelming. Everything seemed to have distorted, and I was no longer sure where I was or how I had gotten there. The field, the truck, even the feeling of terror, everything seemed like part of a dream, but I knew it wasn't. I was completely alone. With my heart pounding, I looked at the field once again, and that's when I saw it. It was not a clear figure, but the silhouette of a person, standing on the horizon. She was far away, almost invisible, but I knew she was there. The presence, silent and observant, made me paralyze. I didn't know whether to run or try to talk, but before I could do anything, she disappeared as quickly as she appeared, as if she were part of the night itself. There was no sound, no movement, but I knew this wasn't normal. Something was testing me, forcing me to understand a reality I couldn't comprehend. I took a step back, once again toward the truck. There was no longer any logic to it. It was as if I had been taken to a place where time didn't matter, where the past and the future were disconnected. The truck finally seemed closer. When I reached him, I took a deep breath, trying to gather my strength. But before I entered, one last sensation ran down my spine. I was no longer alone. The sound of light, soft breathing, as if someone were beside me, cut through the silence. I quickly turned around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty field. However, when I looked in the truck's side mirror, something made me stop. In the reflection, there was a face. A face I had never seen before, its eyes fixed on me. I blinked, and he disappeared. I got into the truck and started the engine, without thinking, accelerating without stopping. The road in front of me was still there, but what worried me wasn't the road. It was the fact that when I last looked, the field and the refuge were gone. As if none of that had really existed. But the feeling of being watched, the stone with my name on it, the face in the mirror, it all stayed with me. And to this day, whenever I travel those roads, I have the impression that I am being followed, that that place is still waiting for me, hidden in the darkness. It was one of those rainy nights where you can barely see the road in front of you, and the sound of water hitting the windshield is the only thing that fills the silence. I had been driving for hours, with the loneliness of the road consuming me, when, in the middle of the rain, I saw a figure on the side of the road. It was a child, alone, with wet hair and soaked clothes. I didn't think twice. I stopped the truck immediately, the headlights illuminating the strange and disconcerting scene. The child was just standing there, looking at me with wide eyes, not moving. Something about the image made me uneasy, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't leave a child out in the rain. I decided to get closer. When I opened the truck door, the wind and rain seemed to hit me harder. I screamed, trying to get the child's attention, but he didn't move. She was quiet, as if waiting for something. My instincts told me not to get any closer, but I couldn't stop thinking about the situation. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, approaching. The child didn't respond, just continued to stare at me. The silence was absolute, except for the rain hitting the surrounding trees and the sound of my own racing heart. Something was wrong, but the only thing I could think of was getting her to safety. I crouched down, trying to understand what was happening. The child looked so small and helpless, but there was something strange about him, something he couldn't explain. Her eyes were fixed on mine, unblinking, as if they were empty. Suddenly, without warning, the child took a step back and disappeared into the darkness of the night. I jumped forward, trying to catch up to her, but all I found was the empty road and the rain falling non-stop. The feeling that something wasn't right intensified. How could a child disappear so quickly in plain sight, with the sound of rain and headlights lighting the way? I stood there for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened. I looked around, shining the truck's flashlight into the area, but there was no sign of anyone. Nothing. What was even stranger was that as I looked around, the road seemed different, as if I was in a place I no longer recognized. The sound of rain became deafening, and suddenly it felt like I was being watched. I took a step back, not knowing what to do, until the feeling of discomfort became unbearable. The road, which had once seemed familiar, was now cold and lifeless. I didn't know what was worse, the child or the strange feeling that something was waiting for me. I looked at the truck's headlights, trying to find some logical explanation for what had just happened. Maybe it was tiredness, I thought, maybe the rain was making me more paranoid than usual. But the feeling that there was something wrong with that place didn't go away. My eyes moved to the rear view, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't the child, but a shadow, something moving quickly across the road, far away but visible enough to make me freeze. I blinked, trying to see better, but the figure was already gone. The strangeness was consuming me, and something inside me screamed for me not to go any deeper, for me to just get out of there. I decided to continue my journey. What else could I do? But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I sped up, trying to get away from whatever was chasing me, but try as I might, something was wrong. I couldn't shake that nagging feeling that there was still someone on that road. The rain didn't let up, and the roads, now more slippery, seemed more treacherous than ever. I looked at the dashboard, and then, once again, the figure appeared, this time reflected in the truck's side mirror. It was the child. She was behind me, but she wasn't moving. His eyes continued to stare at me, in an empty way, as if I weren't human, as if I were something more, something that shouldn't be there. I stopped suddenly, almost losing control of the truck. The side mirror was clean, with no image of the child. I looked around, but the road was still empty, as before. What was happening? The feeling of paranoia was taking over me so intensely that I could barely think clearly. I knew something supernatural was happening, but my mind couldn't process what it was. I looked ahead and, to my surprise, the road now seemed to stretch infinitely, as if it would never end. I hadn't realized it before, but it was as if the landscape was changing, as if I was in a place that was no longer real. Fear began to mix with a feeling of disorientation. What bothered me most was the fact that no matter how much I looked around, there was nothing familiar anymore. I was completely lost. I squinted my eyes, trying to focus on what was ahead, when I heard something that made my blood run cold, a sound, coming from the road, a sound that shouldn't have been there. It was a laugh, low and drawn out, as if it were echoing in the shadows. Trembling, I looked at the rearview mirror once again. I didn't see the child, but the laughter was closer now, as if someone was on top of me. The wind whistled through the cracks in the truck, and the sound of rain mixed with laughter, creating an increasingly suffocating sensation. The laugh, so distorted and unusual, made me feel that danger was closer than I could imagine. I frantically looked everywhere, trying to find some logical explanation for what was happening,
but what I felt was an even more intense sense of dread. The laughter, which had seemed distant before, was now all over me, as if it were coming from inside the truck. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to concentrate, and when I opened them again, the road in front of me was empty. There was nothing left but the rain, the wet road, and a suffocating feeling that something was about to happen. I no longer knew if I was going crazy or if there was something real happening there, but one thing was certain: I couldn't continue on that road.
Without thinking twice, I accelerated the truck, as if I was running away from something. But no matter how hard I tried to leave that place, it seemed like the road never ended. The vision of the path in front of me became increasingly blurred, the trees seeming to close in on me, as if nature itself was swallowing me. Every turn I made left me more lost, and the feeling that I was going in circles began to grow. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to get out of there. Fear was no longer a simple sensation, it was a constant presence, squeezing me every second. Finally, the view in front of me changed. I saw a distant light, a light that seemed to call me. I sped toward it, almost without thinking, until, as I approached, the light revealed itself to be the entrance to a small town. I didn't know if I was relieved to finally find a place or if what was happening there was even stranger. I parked the truck at the entrance to the city and, with shaking hands, got out of the vehicle. The wind was calmer, but the rain was still falling, as if the world was on pause. The feeling that something wasn't right never left me, but at least now I could see something real in front of me. I went to a gas station, looking for some explanation, some sign of life. But, to my surprise, the station was completely empty. There was no one, neither inside nor outside. The surroundings were silent, as if everything was frozen. I looked around, feeling that the invisible presence that followed me was still there, watching every step I took. When I looked at the reflection in the station window, I saw what made me freeze: the child, with his empty eyes, watching me from afar, on the side of the road, where I had stopped. But when I turned to look again, it disappeared again, as if it had never been there. I knew something impossible was happening, but I couldn't run away anymore. I always knew there was something strange about traveling these isolated roads. The solitude of the road is a constant companion, but something that night felt different. I was on my way to a small town, in the middle of nowhere, where the GPS seemed to lose signal every kilometer. The road was deserted, surrounded by forests and empty fields. There was no lighting, just the truck's headlight illuminating the path ahead. That's when I went around a curve, and I saw something on the side of the road that made me squint my eyes. Figures. Almost imperceptible, but there they were, standing, as if they were waiting. I slowed down the truck, trying to understand what those figures were. At first it looked like they were just trees, but as I got closer I could see they weren't. They were people, or something that looked like people. They were motionless, almost camouflaged in the darkness, but their silhouettes were unmistakable. What stopped me dead in my tracks was the fact that none of them seemed to move. There was no reaction, no gesture. As if they were waiting for something. Something I didn't want to understand. My instinct was to speed up and continue the journey, but I couldn't. Something about that vision paralyzed me. I needed to know what was happening. I parked the truck on the side of the road, a few meters from the figures. The air was heavy, as if the room itself was waiting for something, something I couldn't see. I got out of the truck with my heart racing, my footsteps echoing on the silent road. I had no idea what I was doing, but the feeling of something watching me, something much bigger and older than me, drove me forward. When I got to where the figures were, I noticed that they were arranged strangely, in a pattern that I couldn't understand. There were circles, symbols drawn on the ground, with marks that seemed to be written in a language I had never seen. Fear began to spread through my body, but I couldn't stop looking. I crouched down near the symbols, trying to decipher something, anything that would explain to me what was happening there. The figures continued to watch me, but the strangest thing is that, when I looked at them again, they were no longer in the same place. I blinked and they seemed to move slightly, as if they were all around me, but their vision was so distorted that I didn't know what was real. The feeling that there was something supernatural in the air intensified. The wind started to blow stronger, and when I looked up at the sky, I saw that the clouds were forming quickly, as if something was approaching. The atmosphere became oppressive, and the presence of something beyond this world seemed to surround me. I slowly backed away from the symbols, feeling a growing pressure in my chest, as if something was pulling me back. I looked to the side, and that's when I noticed something even more disturbing. The figures, now in a clearer position in front of me, no longer seemed to be people, but shadows, indistinct and vague, as if they were just projections of something much larger and much older. They were still, but I knew without a doubt that they were watching me. His eyes, if they could be called that, shined weak and empty, lifeless, but with a presence that chilled me inside. There was no sound except the wind, but the silence felt like it was suffocating me, as if the very space around me was alive and waiting. I wanted to run, get back in the truck and just leave, but an invisible force held me there, as if the symbols on the ground had rooted me. I looked back to where the truck was parked, and the road now seemed to stretch endlessly, as if time had stopped. The sky was darker, the clouds moving erratically, closing in a way that made me feel like something much bigger was about to crash down on me. I heard a whisper in the wind, as if the figures were trying to communicate with me, but the words didn't make sense. They were not human words. They were incomprehensible sounds, as if an ancient voice was trying to pierce the veil of time. I tried to take a step back, but something stopped me. A strange heat took over my body, and the pressure in the air increased. It was then that, amidst the growing darkness, I saw a glow in the distance. It wasn't a normal light. It was a flame, small but intense, emerging from the center of the symbols. It floated in the air, as if it were not attached to anything, and its color was a deep red, as if it were alive. The air around that flame distorted, creating waves, as if reality itself was being affected by it. Fear began to take over completely, and for the first time in my life, I felt that something much bigger than myself was at stake. It was as if I had walked into a portal, into something that shouldn't be touched. I looked back at the figures that were somehow closer now, and realized that they were no longer static. They were moving, but in a subtle, almost imperceptible way, as if they were getting closer in place. My body panicked, but my legs couldn't move. I couldn't get out of there. The shadows began to stretch across the ground, as if the figures were trying to swallow me, spreading out in a monstrous way. The sound of something heavy being dragged came from the direction of the flame, and I knew without a doubt that it shouldn't be there, that this place was not for any human being to find. Before I could do anything, a scream, loud and piercing, echoed through the trees, breaking the silence of the night, and I was finally able to run, back to the truck, without looking back. I ran back to the truck like my life depended on it. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the sound of my boots hitting the road seemed to be drowned out by the feeling that something was following me. When I finally reached the truck, I shakily threw myself into the driver's seat and started the engine without thinking twice. But the moment the headlights came on, illuminating the road ahead, I saw what made me almost lose control. The figures were there, right in front of me, but now they were no longer just shadows. They were real, with deformed faces, with eyes that seemed to watch me with an intelligence that was not human. I tried to accelerate, but the engine didn't respond. It was as if the truck was stuck in a place that was no longer of this world. Terror paralyzed me. I banged the keys, trying to start the truck again, but everything was dead silent, with no sound except my heart pounding in my chest. The figures, now surrounding the truck, began to move toward my window. I could see the deformed faces, the pale skin, the empty and penetrating eyes, which seemed to want to devour me with their gaze. That was when one of them touched the glass with his hand, his palm full of symbols that glowed with a faint but impossible to ignore glow. At that moment, an unbearable fear took over me. It was as if the road was closing in around me, as if I was being swallowed by an invisible force. It was then that the truck finally reacted. He accelerated suddenly, almost throwing me forward, and I sped down the road. But when I looked back, I saw something that still makes me tremble to this day. There was no one else on the road, no figures, no symbols. Everything seemed normal. The fear I felt, however, did not diminish. I knew something much darker had happened there, something I couldn't explain. The road in front of me seemed endless, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew those figures were following me, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves again. It wasn't an end, but just a pause. I continued driving, without stopping, until the nearest town appeared in the distance. But I didn't know if I really reached it or if I was just guided by a force I couldn't control. When I entered the gas station, I stopped the truck and went to the register, still shaking. The attendant looked at me as if I were just another lost traveler, but no matter how hard he tried to tell me what had happened, the words wouldn't come out. What I had seen, what I had felt, there was no explanation. I knew I shouldn't have stopped on that road, in that place. Something was awakened, something that should never have been touched. And to this day, whenever I travel along those isolated roads, a strange feeling accompanies me, as if I were being followed, as if those eyes were watching me from somewhere.